Here on the Middlesized Garden, I often interview head gardeners and top garden experts to find out what tips and techniques work for them in the garden now. And one of the main problems in any garden is dealing with slug and snail damage. Many people wait until they see their leaves being nibbled in late spring or early summer. But here in the UK, it's late winter, it's February, and many professional gardeners have told me that this is the time to start thinking about protecting yourself against slugs and snails. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'll put links to the professional gardeners, to the videos they featured in, and to their gardens in the description below, along with any other resources. And if you're new here, the Middlesized Garden uploads weekly with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. So if you'd like to see the videos when you open up YouTube, tap the subscribe button. And if you'd like YouTube to notify you when a new video is uploaded, tap the notifications bell. So, why do you start slug and snail precautions early? Well, Tom Brown, who is the head gardener at the beautiful West Dean Gardens in Sussex and is himself an award-winning garden writer, explained this to me. He says 2 snails in February becomes 50 snails later on in early summer and 500 snails by the end of the season. So if you deal with those 2 snails or slugs now in late winter, you're much less likely to suffer from their 500 great-great-great-great-grandchildren at the end of the season. Now, first the bad news. There are some traditional home remedies which it seems don't work. The Royal Horticultural Society here in Britain did a test on a number of remedies. They had unprotected rows of lettuces, and they had rows of lettuces protected by horticultural grit, pine bark mulch, copper tape, ground up eggshells and coffee grounds. But when they tested how much slug and snail damage there was on the protected lettuces versus the unprotected lettuces, it seemed as if none of these remedies actually worked. However, research is still ongoing, and I know that many of you do feel they work in your gardens. So if something works for you, I wouldn't recommend changing it. But if you're starting out or you're not entirely happy, then I wouldn't recommend those 5 methods. So what does work? Let's start with Jane Moore, head gardener at the Bath Priory Hotel and author of Planting for Wildlife and Planting for Butterflies.
Hi, I'm Jane Moore. I'm head gardener at the Bath Priory Hotel. My advice for slugs and snails, I have 2 sets of advice actually. One is on the domestic level, where I don't worry too much about them. I do put a few beer traps down, and I always try and get my little seedlings to be sort of pretty substantial plants before I put them out. I think that's probably the key thing, both domestically and professionally. Put out big plants that are healthy and robust, and they will fight off the attentions, hopefully, of slugs and snails quite well. One of the things that we use professionally here at the Priory is nematodes. They work brilliantly, especially in a confined area, and because we have raised beds in the vegetable garden, they're absolutely perfect for that. The only trouble with them is you have to wait until the soil temperature is at a certain level before they are effective, and there's always that little bit in the spring where the temperature isn't quite right and that sort of thing, so you do end up with a little bit of a lull, but that does give you a chance to let those plants just get that bit bigger before you actually put them out.
I have tried using them, and personally I found them a little too complicated because you have to obey the instructions exactly. However, they are very effective, they are wildlife friendly, they are environmentally friendly, and they work. So they are well worth considering if you're good at following instructions. Jane mentions using beer traps in her garden at home. When BBC Gardener's World magazine surveyed its hundreds of thousands of readers to find out what slug and snail deterrents they found most effective, beer traps came up as one of the most popular. You get a small carton and you sink it into the ground so the lip of the carton is about level with the ground. You fill it with beer, the slugs and snails are attracted to the beer, they fall in and they drown. You obviously have to empty it and then repeat that every so often, possibly daily in the summer. You can buy specifically made beer trap containers, or you can just use something like a yoghurt carton. Jane also made the point that nematodes are best used in a defined area, and this is quite important because it's not realistic to expect to get rid of slugs and snails from your entire garden, and neither would it be a good idea. Slugs and snails actually keep your garden clean. They live off rotting vegetation and fungi, and without them your garden would be a lot messier. And they also provide ideal food for birds and other wildlife. But you don't want them nibbling your seedlings or your dahlias or your lettuce. Stephen Edney is an award-winning head gardener and the owner of the No Name Nursery in Kent, and he's featured in quite a number of the Middlesized Garden's most popular videos about dahlias because he is particularly expert at growing dahlias. But of course, dahlias are the most vulnerable plants to slugs and snails. So let's hear what Steve has to say.
So with organic gardening, it is about control. It's not about eradication. Those days are gone now. It's actually about balance. And so what you want to try and achieve is a healthy population, but not too healthy, of any pest or predator, so that there is a balance of things being eaten and things doing the eating. And sometimes when it comes to, for instance, the mollusks, the slugs and snails, it can be also about avoidance. So we use a physical barrier, which is sheep's wool, and you can buy that as a pelleted form, or if you're lucky enough to actually live near a sheep, lots of sheep and a field where you might be able to go along and pick some of the sheep's wool off of the hedgerow, then you could use that and sort of wad it around the base of the dahlia. And then there are the organic slug pellets as well, the ones which are pheromone baited, and they have ferric oxide in them. So effectively it's like an iron tablet to your eye. So if a slug picks it up and eats it, it basically means that they don't want to feed anymore. So they then crawl away and hopefully then picked up by a hedgehog or a bird, and it won't do the bird or the hedgehog any harm at all. Now the key, and lots of people have said, oh, the new slug pellets don't work at all, or they're not very effective. The key is you actually have to get them wet. With the old slug pellets, it was always about not getting them wet because that gave you the greatest control. With the new slug pellets, you've got to get them wet to activate the pheromone in the slug pellet, which then attracts the mollusk to the pellet. Now with those two things, plus encouraging wildlife into your garden and looking for a more holistic approach to gardening, so thinking about how wildlife accesses your garden. Do you have water bowls so that visiting birds will actually come and have a drink or maybe a bath? And are there holes in the bottom of your fence panel, for instance, so that a hedgehog can come and go? These are all things in your wider garden that will help with control measures.
There are some people who would really prefer you not to use even organically approved slug pellets, and that's because anything you use could leave a residue in the soil. I think the key to this is to use slug pellets very sparingly, and Tom Brown at West Dean Gardens has some excellent ideas about that, so let's hear from him.
And if people use organic slug pellets that are sort of pet and child friendly, don't feel that you've got to mulch the border with slug pellets. 3 or 4 slug pellets per square metre. And the way I've sort of used them in the past is to put a stone and a roofing tile, and then put a few pellets underneath the roofing tile. So the slugs will then find refuge there during the day, and you've got a few pellets there which will deal with it, rather than creating a blue mulch. And people can make the choices, but there are organic, pet-friendly ones available now.
To go back to controlling slugs and snails in a very defined area, you could of course use organic slug pellets or nematodes in your greenhouse or your potting shed or on your terrace as you're bringing your seedlings up to size. So in that case, you probably wouldn't be introducing the slug pellets to the soil at all. Professional gardens that are open to the public need to look really good. The public don't want to see nibbled leaves, and also you might think that wildlife-friendly gardens look untidy. However, I've been amazed at the number of professional gardens, sometimes quite formal ones, that are adopting wildlife-friendly policies and therefore having less in the way of slug and snail problems. Neil Miller has talked to the Middlesized Garden about both tulips and roses, and now let's hear what he has to say about controlling slugs and snails at Hever Castle Gardens.
Hi, I'm Neil Miller, head gardener at Hever Castle in Kent. I think we're going to be talking about slugs and snails. I have to be honest, and I'm going to be really kind of talking from the heart here. I've been at Hever Castle here for about 18 years, and I could honestly count the amount of slugs and snails we have here on one hand. You're all kind of thinking, oh my God, how lucky. So we hardly use any chemicals here. No chemicals means the wildlife is actually thriving, and then the insects and the wildlife come in and they eat all the bugs and the nasties. So it's a lovely kind of, a lovely circle there, I think.
Of course, controlling slugs and snails in your garden also involves about thinking about the conditions in which they flourish, and then not accidentally creating those conditions in your garden. Slugs and snails are most active at night, and they like damp or wet conditions. So don't water your plants, particularly the vulnerable ones, at night or in the evening. Water them in the morning, and then by the time the slugs and snails come out at night, the water should have been absorbed. But if you're doing a lot of watering, it might be worth thinking about whether perhaps you should think about dry garden plants or some of the techniques in dry garden gardening. The most famous dry garden or gravel garden in the United Kingdom is the Beth Chatto Gardens. So I spoke to their head gardener, Åsa Gregors-Wåg, about what they do about slugs and snails.
I'm Åsa Gregors-Wåg here at the Beth Chatto Gardens. When it comes to slugs and snails, that's probably the most asked question we get. You know, how do you keep your slugs away from your hostas? And to be honest, there's no secret trick. I think we're very lucky to be in one of the driest parts of the country. We have an average rainfall of about 20 inches of rain each year, so that certainly helps. We've actually stopped using slug pellets. We used to use wildlife-friendly slug pellets, but the last 2 years we haven't used any at all. So if you go into the garden, you'll definitely see some slug damage. The bigger and coarser leaves don't seem to be as tasty and popular with the slugs and snails. And I would also say that we have a lot of wildlife, which obviously helps. We've got, you know, ducks and moorhens and hedgehogs that eat them. So in a smaller garden, it might be more difficult, especially if you water a lot. And then I think you're just going to have to pick them off by hand.
Well, pick them off by hand. Well, this is certainly a very tried and tested method of controlling slugs and snails. Many gardeners go out at night with a torch and pick them off, but you do then have the problem about what you do with them then. I've seen recommendations to kill them by putting them in the freezer or putting them in plastic bags and throwing them away with the rubbish. One method I would not recommend is the traditional London method, which is where you throw them over the wall to the next door garden. Slugs and snails have a good homing instinct, and they can move surprisingly fast, so they will be back in your garden perhaps before breakfast. My version of picking slugs and snails off by hand is to go around the garden during the day rather than at night, and to look for the places where they lurk. For instance, under bricks or stones, or perhaps pots that are hanging around, and turn those upside down and expose them to the birds. You're not going to get rid of a lot of slugs or snails that way, but of course, going back to what Tom Brown says, if you can get rid of 2, then that's 500 you don't have to deal with later in the year. Also mentioned plants that slugs and snails don't like, and this is another important strategy in keeping the slugs and snail population down to a healthy level in your garden. There'll be a list of slug and snail resistant plants for where you live, and I looked at quite a lot of these, and some of the same plants cropped up again and again. They include verbascum, daylilies, crocosmia, lavender, hydrangeas, salvia, thalictrum, poppies, roses, hardy geraniums, Japanese anemones and asters. Many of these either have hairy leaves, or they have toxic leaves, or they have a smell that slugs or snails don't like. And that reads almost like a plant list of the plants in my own garden. So I think I've accidentally created an environment which is not that friendly to slugs and snails, although of course I do love my dahlias. And that leads me on to another thing. You have to tolerate a bit of slug and snail damage. I'm not growing my dahlias to sell them to a florist, and I'm not entering beautiful dahlia competitions. I just want a lovely garden with a gorgeous dahlia display, and I think I do achieve that. But if you go up very close, you can often see that there is a bit of nibbling, and I'm fine with that, because that's keeping the levels in the garden at a healthy level. It's keeping the slugs and snails so they clear up the old leaves and vegetation. It's feeding the birds, and also this method of quite relaxed and quite targeted slug and snail control, mixing different things, putting out your plants when they're big enough, only treating certain areas, allowing wildlife to do part of the job. All of that is much less work than trying to keep your garden completely free of slugs and snails. If you'd like to see more of the tips and techniques from these professional gardeners, there's a wonderful Beautiful Borders playlist at the end of this video where their gardens are featured, and they are really gorgeous gardens. And do let me know if there's any slug or snail techniques that have worked for you. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.